At Christmas dinner, my mom smirked. We finally sold Grandma's house. You were never in the will anyway. My dad laughed. Good, he'd just waste it. I took a sip of wine and said, cool. Hope you enjoy the cash. Since I'm the one who bought it. The table went silent. I, 32M, sat at that Christmas dinner table watching my mother's smirk spread across her face like poison, and I knew exactly what was coming. She had that look. The one she'd perfected over 3 decades of making sure I understood my place in the family hierarchy. My younger brother sat beside her, wearing his usual expression of smug superiority, while Dad carved the turkey with mechanical precision. Mom leaned back in her chair, swirling her wine glass, and announced that they'd finally sold Grandma's house, the one that had sat empty for 8 months since Grandma passed. She added, almost as an afterthought, that I was never in the will anyway. Her tone suggested this was common knowledge, something everyone had always understood. My brother snickered into his napkin. Dad looked up from the turkey and laughed, agreeing that it was good I wasn't getting anything. He said I'd just waste it. The comment landed exactly as intended, a casual cruelty delivered with the Christmas ham. My sister-in-law, my brother's wife, tried to hide her smile behind her water glass. Their 2 kids, oblivious, kept playing with their phones. I took a sip of wine, letting the moment breathe. Then I told them that was cool, and I hoped they enjoyed the cash. The confusion on their faces was immediate. Mom asked what I meant, her smirk faltering slightly. I set down my wine glass and explained that I was the one who bought the house. Through an LLC. 8 months ago. The silence that followed was spectacular. My brother was the first to break it, asking if I was joking. I wasn't. Dad's face went from confusion to red-hot anger in seconds. He demanded to know what I was talking about. Mom just stared, her mouth slightly open, the smirk completely gone. I'd known for years that I wasn't the favorite. That much had been crystal clear since my brother was born when I was 7. The golden child. The one who could do no wrong. He'd gotten into an expensive private college on Dad's connections while I'd worked my way through state school. He'd gotten seed money for 3 failed businesses while I'd bootstrapped my own company from nothing. When he'd crashed Dad's car at 19, they'd bought him a new one. When I'd asked to borrow the old family sedan at 18, they'd said I needed to learn responsibility. But Grandma had been different. She'd seen through all of it. She'd been the one who believed in me when I'd started my software consulting business from her spare bedroom. She'd been the one who attended my college graduation when my parents had been too busy with my brother's engagement party. She'd been the one who called every week just to check in, to ask how I was really doing. 6 years ago, Grandma had pulled me aside during Thanksgiving. She'd told me about the will, about how she was leaving the house to my parents with the understanding it would eventually come to me. She'd sensed even then that something was off. She'd seen how they treated me, how they dismissed everything I accomplished. She'd made me promise that if anything happened to her, I'd make sure I got what was mine. When Grandma died last April, I'd been overseas for work. By the time I got back for the funeral, the will reading had already happened. Mom had informed me, almost gleefully, that Grandma had left everything to her and Dad. The house, the savings, all of it. When I'd asked about what Grandma had told me years ago, Mom had laughed and said Grandma must have been confused in her old age. Dad had added that maybe if I'd visited more, things would have been different. That had stung. I'd visited Grandma every other week until I'd taken the overseas contract. I'd video called her twice a week from Singapore. My brother lived 20 minutes away and saw her maybe once a month. I'd requested a copy of the will. Mom had said it wasn't necessary, that I needed to accept reality and move on. When I'd pushed, Dad had told me I was being disrespectful to Grandma's memory. My brother had chimed in, saying I was acting entitled to money that was never mine. They'd closed ranks completely, so I'd hired a lawyer. A good one. It had taken 3 weeks, but we'd gotten a court order for the will. And there it was, in black and white. Grandma had left the house to my parents with a conditional clause. If they sold it, 50% of the proceeds were to go to me. The will was ironclad. Grandma had paid good money for an estate attorney to make sure of it. When I'd confronted them with the lawyer's letter, Mom had cried. She'd said I was tearing the family apart over money. Dad had called me ungrateful, said Grandma had left them the house, and they could do what they wanted with it. My brother had accused me of manipulating a dying old woman. They'd refused to acknowledge the conditional clause, claiming it was a suggestion, not a requirement. My lawyer had been clear. We could fight this in court, and I'd win eventually. but it would take time and money and destroy whatever was left of my family relationships. Or I could let it go and walk away. I'd spent 2 weeks wrestling with the decision. Then I'd remembered something Grandma used to say. She told me that sometimes the best revenge was success, but sometimes it was just being smarter than the people who underestimated you. The house had been on the market for a month when I'd made my move. Through a friend who ran a property investment LLC, I'd set up a blind purchase. The LLC was buried under layers of paperwork, untraceable to me without serious digging. I'd offered asking price, all cash, quick close. In that market, with that house needing work, my parents had jumped on it. The whole transaction had taken 3 weeks. I'd gotten the keys in June. I'd paid $340,000 for a house worth maybe $380,000 after repairs. My parents had walked away with the full amount, thinking they'd beaten me, thinking they'd gotten away with cutting me out of my inheritance. Now, sitting at Christmas dinner, watching their faces cycle through disbelief, anger, and fear, I explained the whole thing. How I'd set up the LLC, how I'd made the offer, how I'd closed on the house 7 months ago, how I'd been fixing it up slowly, planning to either rent it out or sell it for a profit. Mom demanded to know why I'd done this. Her voice had gone shrill. I reminded her about the will, about the conditional clause, about how they'd refused to honor Grandma's wishes. I explained that since they'd sold me the house, they'd technically completed a sale. And according to my lawyer, that meant the conditional clause was now triggered. They owed me 50% of what they'd received. Dad exploded. He said I'd tricked them, that this was fraud, that he'd sue me into oblivion. I stayed calm. I told him my lawyer had already reviewed everything. The sale was completely legal. They'd had every opportunity to read the purchase agreement. The LLC was properly registered. Everything was above board. If they wanted to sue, they were welcome to try, but they'd already signed away their rights. My brother called me vindictive. His wife looked horrified. I asked him if he remembered 2 years ago, when I'd loaned him $15,000 to cover his mortgage after his last business venture collapsed. He'd promised to pay me back within 6 months. I was still waiting. He went pale. Mom started crying, saying I was destroying the family over money. I reminded her that she'd been the one who smirked about me not being in the will, that she'd been the one who'd lied about what Grandma wanted, that for 8 months, they'd spent money they knew wasn't entirely theirs to spend. I asked her how much of that $340,000 was left. The silence told me everything. Dad looked at Mom. Mom looked away. My brother suddenly became very interested in his plate. I'd suspected as much. They'd already blown through most of it. Dad's new car in the driveway. The cruise they'd taken in October. My brother's credit card debt they'd probably helped clear. The kitchen renovation I'd noticed when I'd arrived. I laid it out simply. According to the will, they owed me $170,000. I knew they didn't have it. So here was my offer. I'd forgive the debt completely. They could keep what was left of the money. But in return, I was done. No more family dinners. No more pretending we were close. No more loans to my brother. No more being the family disappointment while watching them celebrate my brother's mediocrity. I was out. Mom asked what I meant by out. I explained I meant exactly that. I'd show up for major events if absolutely necessary, but I was done being the punching bag, done being the afterthought, done watching them favor my brother while treating me like I was lucky to be included. They could have their money and their golden child. I'd have my peace. Dad said I was being dramatic. I laughed. I asked him when he'd last asked me about my business, about my life, about anything that mattered to me. He couldn't answer. I asked Mom when she'd last called me just to talk, not to ask for something or to tell me about my brother's latest accomplishment. She looked at her lap. My brother tried to intervene, saying we were all family and this was stupid. I turned to him and asked if he considered me family when he'd told his kids I was too busy to come to their birthday parties, when I'd never even been invited. Asked if he considered me family when he'd told people at his company that he'd built his career without any help, conveniently forgetting the $50,000 in total I'd loaned him over the years. He couldn't meet my eyes. I stood up. I told them I'd send the formal paperwork forgiving the debt after Christmas. They'd have it in writing that I wasn't coming after the money. In return, I expected them to respect my boundaries. I'd be civil at necessary family events, but the days of being their backup plan and emotional punching bag were over. Mom asked what Grandma would think of this. That one almost broke me, but I held firm. I told her Grandma would be proud that I'd stood up for myself. That grandma had spent her last years watching them diminish and dismiss me, and she'd tried to do something about it. The will hadn't been about money. It had been about making sure I knew someone valued me. They'd tried to take that away, and now they were facing consequences. I walked out, left my coat, left the presents I'd brought, got in my car, and drove back to my apartment. My phone started buzzing before I'd made it to the highway. Messages from my brother calling me selfish. Voicemails from Dad threatening legal action. Texts from Mom saying I was breaking her heart. I blocked them all. For the first time in my adult life, I felt light. Update 1. It's been 3 weeks since Christmas dinner. I figured I should update since some people had asked what happened next. The day after Christmas, my brother showed up at my apartment. I almost didn't let him in, but curiosity got the better of me. He looked terrible, exhausted, stressed. He asked if we could talk, really talk, without Mom and Dad involved. Against my better judgment, I made coffee and we sat down. He admitted things I'd been waiting years to hear. That he knew they favored him. That he'd taken advantage of it. That watching me walk out on Christmas had shaken something loose in him. His wife had apparently given him an earful on the drive home about how they'd all treated me. He explained the financial situation. They'd burned through almost $280,000 of the house money. Dad's car had been $60,000. The cruise was $25,000. They'd cleared $40,000 in credit card debt for my brother. Another $30,000 on the kitchen. More on furniture, jewelry for Mom. A down payment on a vacation property they were considering. The casual way they'd spent money they'd stolen from me made my blood boil. My brother apologized for the loans he'd never repaid. He said he'd been keeping a mental tally, and it was closer to $60,000 over the years, not $50,000. He admitted he had no way to pay it back now. His current business was struggling. His wife was the main breadwinner. They were barely keeping their heads above water, even with Mom and Dad's help clearing their debt. I asked him what he wanted from me. He said he didn't want anything. He just wanted me to know he was sorry. That he'd been a terrible brother. That he understood if I never wanted to see him again. Then he left. I didn't know what to do with that. Part of me wanted to stay angry. Part of me recognized that it had taken courage for him to come alone, to admit the truth. Mom and Dad were a different story. The lawyer's letter forgiving the debt arrived at their house on New Year's Eve. According to my brother, who texted me later, Mom had a breakdown. She'd apparently convinced herself I'd been bluffing about the LLC and the house. Seeing it in legal paperwork made it real. Dad had locked himself in his study for 2 days. On January 2nd, Mom called from a number I didn't recognize. I answered without thinking. She was calmer than I'd expected. She said she'd been talking to her therapist, someone she'd apparently started seeing after Grandma died. The therapist had helped her understand some things about how they'd treated me over the years. Mom admitted she'd been jealous. Of me. It sounded insane when she said it, but she explained. I'd always been independent, self-sufficient. I'd never needed them the way my brother did. And instead of being proud of that, she'd resented it. She'd felt more needed by my brother, more important. So she'd leaned into that relationship and let mine deteriorate. She cried. She said she'd failed me as a mother. That she'd let her own insecurities damage her relationship with her son. That she'd convinced herself I didn't care because I didn't need their approval the way my brother did. The apology felt genuine, but years of hurt don't dissolve with one phone call. I told her I appreciated her honesty, but I needed time. Real time. Not a few weeks, and then back to normal. I needed to figure out who I was without constantly seeking validation I was never going to get from them. She said she understood. Dad hasn't reached out. According to my brother, he's still furious. He feels humiliated. Outsmarted. He's apparently told people I manipulated the whole situation, that I took advantage of an old woman and then my grieving parents. My brother said he tried to correct the narrative, but Dad shut him down. The house itself is coming along. I've been spending weekends there, doing repairs. Painting. Fixing the back deck Grandma always meant to replace. It's therapeutic. Every nail I hammer feels like reclaiming something. The place holds good memories. Summers on that back porch with Grandma. Learning to cook in that kitchen. Reading in the window seat she'd had installed just for me. I'm not sure what I'll do with it long term. Part of me wants to keep it, turn it into the home Grandma always hoped someone would make of it. Part of me thinks selling it and moving on might be healthier. I've got time to decide. A few people have asked if I regret how I handled Christmas dinner. Honestly, no. Could I have been more private about it? Sure. But they'd made a public spectacle of cutting me out of the inheritance. They'd done it at a family gathering, with witnesses, specifically to humiliate me. Returning that energy felt appropriate. The fallback has been interesting. Extended family has mostly sided with me once they heard the full story. Grandma's sister, my great-aunt, called me crying. She said she'd suspected something was wrong when my parents had rushed through settling the estate. She wished she'd pushed harder to see the will herself. She told me Grandma had talked about me constantly in her final years, how proud she was of what I'd built. Some of my parents' friends have cut them off, apparently disgusted by the whole situation. Others have rallied around them, painting me as the villain. I've stopped caring about managing other people's opinions. My brother texts occasionally, usually just checking in. He started paying me back in tiny increments. $100 here, $200 there. I told him he didn't have to, but he insisted, said it was important for him to do this. I'm letting him. I spent last weekend at the house, stripping wallpaper in what used to be Grandma's craft room. I found a box she'd hidden in the closet. Inside were photo albums, pictures of me at every age, school projects I'd made her, cards I'd sent from college, a journal where she'd written about her grandkids. The entries about me were full of pride and love. The entries about my brother were worried, concerned about his dependence on his parents. There was a letter too, addressed to me, unsealed. She must have written it not long before she died. In it, she told me she knew my parents favored my brother. She said it wasn't my fault, that I'd done nothing wrong. She urged me to build my own life, my own family, my own happiness separate from their approval. She said the house was her way of giving me a foundation, literally and figuratively. She also warned me they might try to cut me out. She'd added the conditional clause specifically because she'd overheard Mom and Dad talking about keeping the full proceeds if they sold. Grandma had been sharper than any of us realized. She'd planned for exactly what happened. Reading that letter in her empty craft room, I cried. Not sad tears. Relief. Validation. Grief for what could have been if she'd lived longer. Gratitude that she'd seen me clearly when my own parents couldn't. I'm doing okay. Better than okay, actually. Work is good. I've started dating someone new, someone who comes from a functional family and finds my whole situation bizarre. That perspective helps. Reminds me this isn't normal, that I'm not crazy for wanting better. The hardest part is holidays. I spent New Year's alone by choice. It felt peaceful. I'm planning to skip Easter unless something changes significantly. My birthday is in March. I'm already preparing for the awkward texts and calls from family members trying to play peacemaker. But I'm not backing down. I've started seeing a therapist myself, working through decades of being the family scapegoat. It's helping. Slowly. The house is becoming mine. Not just legally, but emotionally. I'm making it into something new while honoring what it was. Grandma would like that. As for my parents, I don't know what the future holds. Maybe Mom's therapy will lead to real change. Maybe Dad will eventually see past his pride. Maybe my brother and I will rebuild something authentic. Or maybe this is just how it is now. Distant, civil, separate. Either way, I'm finally putting myself first. And that feels like the real inheritance Grandma wanted me to have. Not the house, not the money, but the strength to stand up for myself and walk away from people who diminish me, even if they're family. Grandma would be proud. And for the first time in my life, that's enough. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with friends or family who might enjoy it too. Your support means a lot. And if you have any thoughts, questions, or story ideas, drop them in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. See you in the next story.